Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. The name Nietzsche lingers in the air like a riddle, sharp and elusive. To utter it is to summon both awe and unease, to invoke a mind that cuts through the veneer of civilization with the precision of a scalpel and the force of a hammer. In his words, we find no shelter, only a relentless demand to confront existence in its rawest form. Yet Nietzsche was no mere destroyer. His project was, at its heart, a reckoning with what it means to be human when the old gods have crumbled, when the illusions that once structured life have faded into dust. He was not alone in this confrontation. His assertion that God is dead was less a triumph than a warning, one echoed by thinkers who came after him, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and, in our own time, Thomas Metzinger, whose work on the illusion of the self suggests that even the most intimate certainties are not what they seem. Nietzsche anticipated the vertigo of such revelations. Without a divine order to orient us, without an innate, immovable self, what remains? The temptation for many has been to retreat, to seek comfort in new structures that mimic the old ones, whether in politics, ideology, or consumerist distractions. But Nietzsche saw a different path, one marked not by surrender, but by self-overcoming. In the village where he was born, among the stillness of provincial Germany, such thoughts might have seemed distant, unnecessary. Yet the young Nietzsche did not remain in the familiar. He excelled, outpacing his peers, rising to prominence as a scholar of ancient Greece before he was even 30. But institutional life was too small for him, its boundaries too constraining. He abandoned it, choosing exile in the Alps, where he wrote with the urgency of a man possessed. The landscape mirrored his ideas, vast, untamed, indifferent to human frailty. His philosophy demanded courage, a willingness to embrace uncertainty rather than shrink from it. This challenge is not confined to the past. Today, as artificial intelligence challenges traditional notions of autonomy and authorship, posthumanist thought questions the primacy of the human experience itself, Nietzsche's call to self-overcoming remains as pressing as ever. Rosi Braidotti, one of the leading contemporary voices in critical posthumanism, extends Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch beyond the individual, framing it as a collective imperative, not merely to transcend personal limitations, but to rethink what it means to be human in an era where biology and technology are increasingly entwined. Yet Nietzsche knew that such transformations do not come without cost. His own life was a study in paradox, brilliant yet lonely, visionary yet tormented. He loved, but was not loved in return. He wrote, but was not read. He lived at the edge of his own thought, and in the end, it was perhaps too much. In the streets of Turin, he saw a horse being beaten and collapsed into madness, as if the suffering of the world had finally broken him. To envy is to confess a hidden longing. It is a pulse, an ache, a quiet but insistent reminder that we are not yet who we wish to be. Yet, from childhood, we are trained to deny this emotion, to suppress it as though it were a mark of moral failing rather than a signal of unrealized potential. Nietzsche, ever the challenger of comfortable illusions, urged us to see envy not as a shameful weakness, but as a map, a guide toward the life we secretly desire but have not yet dared to claim. This was not a new idea, though Nietzsche gave it sharper teeth. In the 17th century, Baruch Spinoza had written of the destructive potential of envy, calling it hatred at another's happiness. But Nietzsche saw something else within it, possibility. Today, psychologists studying motivation find support for his intuition. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, 2011, suggests that benign envy without resentment, can serve as a powerful driver of self-improvement. It sharpens our focus, pushes us toward goals that without such comparison we might never dare to attempt. Nietzsche understood this before the data existed. We must not suppress envy, but harness it. Yet society, shaped as it is by centuries of moral conditioning, resists this idea. Christianity, Nietzsche argued, had built a grand edifice of virtue around passivity. The meek shall inherit the earth, the suffering shall be rewarded, the lowly shall be lifted up. But what if these were not eternal truths, but the inventions of those too powerless to grasp what they truly wanted? Nietzsche's critique of Christianity was not mere provocation. It was a psychological diagnosis. He saw in it what contemporary thinkers, like Slavoj Žižek would later describe as a form of ideological self-deception, an intricate system designed not only to soothe suffering, but to sanctify it, to make a virtue of what, in another light, would be seen as failure. It is a harsh conclusion, but not without merit. Nietzsche did not claim that we can all have what we envy. His own life was proof enough of that. His desires often ended in frustration, his work largely ignored in his time. But to suppress desire, to lie to oneself about what one truly wants, was to live dishonestly. He urged us instead to face our envy directly, to see in it a challenge rather than a defeat. If you envy the artist, the philosopher, the leader, then ask, what in them calls to you? What part of yourself do they reflect, unfulfilled and waiting? This is the essence of Nietzsche's Übermensch, not a ruler over others, but a master of the self. The Übermensch does not kneel before inherited morality, does not accept limitations imposed by the weak or the fearful. Today, in an age where meritocracy is often a veneer for entrenched privilege, where self-actualization is commodified and sold back to us in bite-sized affirmations, Nietzsche's call remains urgent. True self-overcoming is not about external success, but about raw, difficult, necessary work of becoming what we truly are. And that begins, perhaps, in the quiet recognition of our envy, not as a sin, but as a door. Nietzsche drank only water, occasionally milk. He viewed alcohol not simply as a substance, but as a metaphor, one of civilization's great narcotics alongside Christianity, designed to dull the sharp edges of existence. To drink was to retreat, to accept the illusion that all was well when in truth life demanded engagement, struggle, transformation. He was not alone in this suspicion. Today, neuroscience confirms what Nietzsche intuited. Alcohol diminishes cognitive function, blunts emotional processing, and, crucially, dampens the very discomfort that drives ambition. A 2020 study in Nature Communications identified alcohol as a primary disruptor of the brain's prefrontal cortex, the responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and arguably the formation of self-determination. For Nietzsche, this self-determination was everything. He saw in intoxication the same mechanism he despised in religion, a surrender to inertia. His contemporaries, like the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, had seen suffering as something to be endured, even escaped through detachment. Nietzsche, ever the contrarian, demanded the opposite, not resignation, but affirmation. He insisted that life must be seized, even at its most painful, even at its most indifferent. This ethos, later echoed by existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, asks us to reject passivity, to resist the seductions of comfort. In his declaration that there have been two great narcotics in European civilization, Christianity and alcohol, Nietzsche recognized a truth that extends beyond his time. We have not abandoned numbing agents, we have merely changed their forms. Today, it is not only alcohol or faith that dulls the will, it is digital saturation, social media algorithms engineered to pacify, consumer culture that turns ambition into mere acquisition. If Nietzsche were alive now, his scorn would likely be directed not at the wine glass, but at the infinite scroll, the curated illusion of fulfillment without action. Yet his warning was never simply about substances. It was about what we do in the face of discomfort. Modern psychology, from Viktor Frankl's work on meaning to the resilience studies of Angela Duckworth, supports Nietzsche's insistence that growth is born from struggle. Frankl, who survived Auschwitz, argued that suffering, properly framed, becomes the catalyst for purpose. He did not write from a place of ease, nor did he seek the comforts that might have softened his suffering. Instead, he turned pain into philosophy, isolation into insight. This is what he meant by amor fati, the love of fate. Not resignation, but radical acceptance. Not the passive endurance of life's difficulties, but their embrace as necessary as fuel for self-creation. His Übermensch does not seek refuge in numbness. He does not drink to forget, nor does he believe in salvation. He stands fully present, unshielded, willing to suffer, because he understands that suffering is not an obstacle to becoming. It is the crucible in which the self is forged. Nietzsche's challenge is not easy. It asks us to relinquish illusions, to reject easy comforts, to abandon the very distractions that society insists we need. But in doing so, he offers something far greater than escape, the possibility of transformation, the chance to live not as a spectator, but as a creator of meaning itself. When Nietzsche declared, God is dead, it was neither a victory cry nor a simple provocation. It was a diagnosis, an unflinching recognition of the unraveling of a centuries-old structure that had given humanity its moral and existential framework. He did not celebrate this death. On the contrary, he feared the vacuum it would create. Without God, without the grand narratives of religion, where would meaning come from? He anticipated a slow descent into nihilism, a world in which people, stripped of inherited purpose, would drift aimlessly, clinging either to shallow distractions or to new, more insidious dogmas. This crisis was not confined to the 19th century. It persists today, manifesting in new and unexpected ways. As political scientist Francis Fukuyama noted in The End of History and the Last Man, the modern world, having abandoned divine teleology, now wrestles with a profound spiritual void. While material progress accelerates, questions of meaning remain unresolved. Fukuyama feared that liberal democracy, for all its successes, might not satisfy the deeper human need for purpose. Nietzsche had foreseen this, that the collapse of religious faith would not be met with immediate enlightenment, but with confusion, resentment, and a desperate search for replacement beliefs. And replacements have come, but have they offered true meaning, or merely the illusion of it? Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, that it was a system designed not for truth but for psychological comfort, extends just as easily to the ideological movements of today. He feared that, in the absence of God, people would not become free-thinking individuals, but would instead adopt new belief systems with the same uncritical devotion. We see this in the fervour of political tribalism, in the rise of new moral orthodoxies that demand absolute allegiance, in the way digital culture amplifies conformity rather than independent thought. Contemporary philosopher Byung-Chul Han, in The Burnout Society, argues that modernity has not freed us from dogma, but has replaced external coercion with internalized self-surveillance, an endless pressure to perform, to optimize, to adhere to shifting yet rigid social expectations. For Nietzsche, this was the great danger of the herd mentality. The masses, unwilling to bear the weight of personal responsibility, seek collective absolution. They obey not a priest but an algorithm. They find not transcendence but endless distraction. What he called die herd, the herd, still thrives, though its gods have changed. His call to self-overcoming remains as urgent as ever, not as a call to arrogance, but to genuine independence, to think critically, to resist easy answers, to forge meaning not from inherited doctrine, but through personal struggle and creation. Yet Nietzsche did not leave us without hope. If God is dead, then we are free to create. He saw art, philosophy, and music not as passive entertainments, but as new sacred texts, as blueprints for meaning in a world without divine order. He admired the Greeks for their tragedies, which did not offer comfort but catharsis, a reckoning with suffering that left the individual strengthened rather than pacified. He longed for a cultural transformation where, instead of seeking salvation, we would embrace life as it is, with all its chaos, all its uncertainty. The challenge he left us with is not an easy one. It demands that we resist nihilism without retreating into illusion, that we cultivate meaning without relying on external validation. It asks us to stand alone, to affirm existence not because it offers guarantees, but precisely because it does not. This is what it means to live dangerously. This is what it means to be free. Every era has its crises, its existential tremors, its moments where the scaffolding of meaning shakes under the weight of change. For Nietzsche, the late 19th century was such a moment, a time when the great narratives of religion and tradition were unraveling, leaving behind a void that few were prepared to face. But his concerns were never just historical, they were prophetic. He understood that without inherited structures of belief, humanity would struggle not just with meaning, but with power. Who defines values when the old gods have fallen? Who decides what is good, what is just, what is worth striving for? This was not an abstract concern. Nietzsche foresaw the rise of ideologies that would attempt to fill the vacuum left by faith, and he feared that most people would not be ready to engage with the freedom this entailed. Instead of forging their own values, they would cling to new forms of control, disguising submission as conviction. Michel Foucault, a philosopher deeply influenced by Nietzsche, would later explore this idea through the lens of power and discourse. He argued that institutions, whether religious, political, or scientific, do not simply describe reality, they create it. Truth, in this sense, is not neutral, but a product of who wields authority over knowledge. And today, who wields that authority? Nietzsche might have been fascinated, if not horrified, by the way algorithms have become the new high priests of belief, shaping thought not through direct coercion, but through suggestion, repetition, and data-driven reinforcement. In the digital age, the herd does not gather in churches, it congregates in echo chambers, where dissent is punished and consensus is manufactured. Byung-Chul Han, in his critique of digital culture, argues that we have entered a new phase of control, one where the individual, believing themselves free, is in fact governed by invisible forces, from market-driven desires to the compulsions of social validation. Nietzsche would have seen in this a grand irony. The promise of modernity was liberation from the rigid structures of the past, yet it has birthed new forms of conformity, ones that are even harder to recognize because they do not announce themselves as authority. His concept of Selbstüberwindung, self-overcoming, becomes all the more relevant in a world where distraction rather than direct oppression is the primary obstacle to self-creation. It is not simply external forces that must be resisted, but the internal seductions of ease, of comfort, of the passive consumption of meaning rather than its active construction. And yet, there is still the possibility of something more. Nietzsche did not despair, though he saw the dangers clearly. He believed in the power of art, of philosophy, of the creative act as a means of forging new values. His admiration for the Greeks was rooted in their ability to confront tragedy without seeking false solace, to use suffering as a catalyst rather than a reason to retreat. This remains the challenge he leaves us with: to create, not merely to inherit, to think, not merely to repeat, to shape rather than be shaped. To read Nietzsche is to be unsettled, to feel the weight of responsibility that comes with true freedom. He does not offer comfort, nor does he seek to. He offers instead a question that lingers long after the last page is turned. Now that the old gods are dead, what will you create in their place? To exist in Nietzsche's world is to stand at the precipice, staring into the abyss of meaninglessness, and to choose not retreat, not surrender, but creation. The death of God was never simply about theology. It was a seismic shift in human consciousness, a dismantling of the very architecture of certainty. And yet, Nietzsche did not weep for the loss of divine order. He saw it as a necessary destruction, a clearing of the old to make way for something new. But what? This was the question that haunted him, and it is the same question that lingers in our time. In his critique of mass democracy, Nietzsche feared that without the guiding hand of religion, people would not rise to the challenge of self-creation, but would instead turn to new forms of collective obedience. He saw in the rise of egalitarianism a potential danger, not because he despised equality itself, but because he recognized how easily it could be weaponized into a leveling force, one that punished distinction rather than cultivated it. This is not to say he dismissed solidarity. Rather, he warned against the illusion that all desires, all ambitions, all struggles should be flattened into sameness. The Übermensch was not simply an individualist, but a creator of values, a being who did not look to the herd for affirmation, but forged their own path. Contemporary critics like Jordan Peterson, though often misrepresenting Nietzsche, have capitalized on elements of this idea, arguing that the loss of traditional structures has left individuals directionless, prone to ideological possession rather than authentic self-determination. But Nietzsche would likely push further. It is not enough to lament the absence of structure. One must build anew, not by returning to the past, but by embracing the creative chaos of the present. This is where Nietzsche's legacy intersects with thinkers like Gilles Deleuze, who saw in him a rejection of static identities, a call to continual becoming. For Nietzsche, one is never simply a self. One is always in the process of becoming something greater. But becoming is painful. It requires a willingness to stand alone, to resist not just external pressures, but internal fears. Nietzsche understood this intimately. His own life was a testament to both the power and the cost of self-overcoming. He was not celebrated in his time. He was ridiculed, ignored, left to wrestle with his thoughts in solitude. And yet, his work did not die with him. It endured because it speaks to something fundamental, something that remains unresolved in every generation, the struggle to find meaning in a world that offers none. If the 19th century was the beginning of this crisis, the 21st century is its full unfolding. We live in an era of unprecedented freedom, and yet, as Nietzsche predicted, this freedom often feels more like weightlessness than liberation. Without inherited meaning, we drift. Some find solace in nostalgia, in the revival of old dogmas under new names. Others immerse themselves in technology, in digital landscapes that offer the illusion of connection without the substance of engagement. But Nietzsche's challenge remains. Will you accept this drift, or will you carve your own path? To read Nietzsche is to be unsettled, but it is also to be invited, to struggle, to create, to refuse the easy answers. It is to recognize that meaning is not given, nor is it found, it is made. And in that making, in that raw confrontation with existence, something extraordinary becomes possible, the birth of a self, not inherited, but willed into being. To step into Nietzsche's world is to abandon the security of preordained purpose. There is no divine blueprint, no cosmic justice, no guarantee that life will reward effort with meaning. Instead, there is only the raw, unfiltered reality of existence, indifferent to human longing. This is not despair, it is a challenge. For Nietzsche, the recognition of this truth was not an end, but a beginning. He demanded that we do not turn away from it, that we do not retreat into comforting illusions, but that we face it fully and in doing so, create something of our own. This radical demand to become who we are has echoed through generations of thinkers, evolving with the crises of each era. When Jean-Paul Sartre declared that existence precedes essence, he was articulating a Nietzschean truth. We are not born with meaning. We must forge it. Simone de Beauvoir extended this idea into the realm of gender and social identity, arguing that becoming oneself is not merely an intellectual exercise, but an act of rebellion against inherited definitions. In more recent years, scholars like Judith Butler have pushed this further, dismantling fixed identities altogether, arguing that all selfhood is performance, an ongoing act of creation rather than a stable essence. Nietzsche anticipated these revolutions. He knew that selfhood was not a given, but a process, a constant negotiation between who we are and who we strive to be. And yet, this striving is neither easy nor comfortable. It requires a willingness to endure uncertainty, to exist without the safety net of absolute truth. This is where Nietzsche's thought collides with that of existential risk theorists like Nick Bostrom, who argue that as technology accelerates, the choices we make now will determine not just our own futures, but the trajectory of human civilization. The freedom Nietzsche envisioned, freedom from inherited meaning, has expanded into something even more daunting, the freedom to shape the very fabric of reality itself. But shaping reality requires more than ambition. It requires will. Nietzsche saw in the modern world a creeping inertia, a tendency toward passive consumption rather than active creation. He would have been fascinated, if not horrified, by the digital age, where algorithmic structures dictate not only what we consume, but how we think. The herd does not need a shepherd when it willingly follows the current. Here, Byung-Chul Han's critique of digital capitalism is deeply Nietzschean. The structures that govern us are no longer external authorities but internal compulsions, invisible forces that shape desire without coercion. In this landscape, self-overcoming is not just a philosophical ideal, it is an act of survival. And yet, Nietzsche never believed that such transformation was possible for everyone. He was not a democrat of the soul. He saw the potential for greatness in the few, not the many. This is perhaps his most uncomfortable legacy, the part of his philosophy that resists easy assimilation into modern egalitarian ideals. But rather than reading this as an endorsement of hierarchy, it can be understood as a provocation. Are you willing to become more than what you are? Are you willing to reject the comforts of convention, the ease of passive belief, the seduction of certainty? The challenge Nietzsche leaves us with is not simply to think, but to act. Not to accept meaning as something given, but to forge it as something earned. He does not offer reassurance, nor does he promise success. He offers instead the only thing he ever truly valued, the opportunity to become. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast, an audio essay read by me, Holly, your digital narrator. To learn more about the subjects covered today, check out the links in the show notes. Until next time.